They said I didn't belong. They tried to make me small, to silence me with humiliation. But what they didn't know was that I've faced storms before, and I've learned how to rise above them. This is my story, not just of standing tall but of igniting change. Because dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And today, I'm here to claim mine, for myself and for those who come after me. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The airport was alive with its usual buzz, the steady hum of announcements blending with the rolling of suitcases and the occasional excited chatter. For me, it was just another stop on my journey, a brief pause before stepping into a meeting that could define the next phase of my career. As I adjusted the strap of my leather laptop bag on my shoulder, I couldn't help but think of my parents. Their voices played in my mind, as they often did when I found myself at crossroads. My father's words echoed the loudest, "Stand tall, Naomi. No one can take your dignity unless you let them." It was his mantra, passed down like a shield to protect me from the slings and arrows of a world that often underestimated women like me. I rolled my carry-on toward the gate, my heels clicking with quiet confidence against the polished floor. My tailored blazer and crisp white blouse weren't just a wardrobe choice, they were my armor. I knew what they said to the world: here is a woman who belongs. Here is a woman you cannot dismiss. The announcement for my flight crackled through the speakers. And I stepped forward into the queue for boarding. As I scanned my ticket, the gate agent gave me a professional smile. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Carter." "Thank you," I said, returning the gesture as I walked toward the jet bridge. First class was a treat I didn't often indulge in, but this meeting was important enough to justify the splurge. Besides, I'd worked hard for every step that brought me to this moment. The cabin was a blend of muted luxury, with wide leather seats and hushed conversations. A man in a business suit flipped through a glossy magazine, while a woman in pearls sipped her pre-flight champagne. As I made my way to my seat, I noticed their glances, quick, assessing, and not entirely friendly. I'd grown used to these looks. They didn't sting as much anymore, though they still landed. Sliding my carry-on into the overhead compartment, I settled into my seat and exhaled. The plush comfort of the chair and the soft lighting of the cabin felt like a small reward for the long hours I'd put into preparing for this trip. The presentation in my bag was ready, polished to perfection. If all went well, this meeting could secure not only a major contract for my firm but also my reputation as a trailblazer in my field. I was pulling out my notebook when the flight attendant caught my eye. Her uniform was pristine, and her name tag read Rachel. She moved with brisk efficiency, greeting passengers with a mechanical smile. When her gaze landed on me, her expression shifted ever so slightly, just enough for me to notice. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes lingered longer than necessary. "Good afternoon," she said. "Good afternoon," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Her gaze flicked to my laptop bag and then back to me. It wasn't the first time I'd been scanned like that, as though my very presence was an anomaly. I gave her a small, polite nod and returned to my notebook, jotting down some final thoughts for my presentation. If she had something on her mind, she didn't say it, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of asking. As the other passengers filed in, I noticed a few more sideways glances, but I focused on my work. The notebook was a comforting anchor, its pages filled with carefully outlined points and contingency plans. I like to be prepared. It was how I navigated a world that often threw up unexpected barriers. The flight was set to board in full, and the hum of conversation grew louder as passengers settled into their seats. I adjusted my seatbelt, took a sip of the water that had been placed on my tray, and allowed myself a moment to enjoy the calm before takeoff. I thought about my family again, my father, who had spent decades as a factory worker, and my mother, whose grace under pressure was legendary. Everything I'd achieved felt like a tribute to their sacrifices. They'd given me wings. And now here I was, flying toward my dreams, literally and figuratively. Rachel passed by again, her steps measured and deliberate. I glanced up and caught her looking my way. This time. Her smile was tight, almost perfunctory. Something about it set off a faint alarm in the back of my mind, but I brushed it aside. Instead, I focused on the task ahead. Delivering a presentation that would not only secure a future for my firm but also solidify my place in an industry that didn't always make room for people like me. I didn't know it yet. But this flight was about to test not just my resilience but also the values my parents had instilled in me. I looked out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway. The sky stretched wide and endless, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much further I intended to go. Little did I know. Turbulence wasn't just waiting in the skies, it was waiting for me right here in this cabin. The plane hummed with the energy of pre-flight preparations. Passengers settled in, overhead bins slammed shut, and the occasional voice drifted above the din. I had just started jotting down a few notes for my presentation when a shadow fell across my tray table. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was polite but carried an unmistakable edge. I looked up to see Rachel, the flight attendant, standing over me. Her uniform was immaculate, but her smile was sharp, too sharp. "Yes?" I replied, keeping my voice calm. "May I see your boarding pass?" she asked. My eyebrows lifted in surprise. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into my bag. Why was she asking for my boarding pass now? After I was already seated? Still, I handed it to her with a steady hand. She took the pass, her eyes scanning it as if it held some hidden code. Her frown deepened. And I could feel the tension in the air as other passengers began to glance in our direction. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "This appears to be a mistake," she said, handing the pass back to me. "You'll need to move to economy." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. I blinked, searching her face for some hint that this was a misunderstanding. But there was no warmth, no reassurance, just a firm finality in her tone. "There's no mistake," I said, my voice firm but composed. "This seat was purchased weeks ago, and it's been confirmed." Rachel's lips thinned, and her gaze flicked toward the rest of the cabin as if searching for backup. "I'm afraid I'll have to insist. This seat isn't available to you." Her words landed like a slap. My breath caught, but I refused to let the rising heat in my chest show. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of us, her standing with authority, and me sitting, forced to defend what was rightfully mine. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" I asked, still calm. "It's not about the ticket," she said, her tone crisp. "We've had a booking error. And this seat isn't appropriate." "Not appropriate?" I repeated, incredulous. "What does that mean?" Her smile tightened, and she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I can explain later if necessary. For now, I need you to move." I could feel the eyes of the other passengers on me. Some were whispering, their hushed tones like the rustle of leaves. Others avoided looking directly at us, their discomfort palpable. The humiliation swelled in my chest, threatening to crack my composure. I took a deep breath. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." "I can involve the captain if you'd prefer," she said, folding her arms. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between us. My options were limited. Drawing this out would only make the spectacle worse, and I could feel the weight of the passenger's judgment pressing down on me. I swallowed my anger and nodded. "Fine," I said quietly. "I'll move." Gathering my belongings, I stood, acutely aware of how every eye seemed to track my movements. My steps down the aisle felt heavy. And the seat Rachel led me to in the cramped economy section felt like a punishment. As I slid into the narrow chair, I stared out the window, trying to process what had just happened. The cool professionalism I'd wrapped around myself like armor had been punctured, leaving me vulnerable. Around me, the atmosphere in economy was different. There was no hum of polite conversation. No clink of glasses. Instead, it was a quiet mix of frustration and fatigue, with passengers packed in like sardines. I adjusted my bag under the seat, my fingers trembling slightly. I couldn't help but replay the scene in my mind. The way Rachel had looked at me, the tone of her voice, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about the assumption that I didn't belong. That my presence in first class was an error to be corrected. A flight attendant brushed past me, barely acknowledging my presence, and I clenched my fists. My parents hadn't sacrificed so much for me to sit in silence while being treated like an outsider in my own life. I thought about my father's words again, "Stand tall, Naomi." I straightened in my seat and exhaled. The anger simmering beneath the surface wasn't weakness, it was fuel. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving swiftly as I composed a message to David. A longtime friend and senior executive at the airline. I detailed the incident, keeping the language professional but pointed. "Please escalate this to the board immediately," I wrote. "This is unacceptable." I hit send, and a sense of calm washed over me. The humiliation still lingered, but now, so did determination. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not for me and not for the next person who might face the same treatment. Rachel might have moved me physically, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, a steady backdrop to my swirling thoughts. Outside the window, clouds drifted lazily past. Their serenity a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I had always prided myself on staying composed under pressure, but Rachel's actions had struck a nerve I couldn't ignore. I adjusted in the cramped economy seat, the armrests pressing against my sides as if to remind me that I had been relegated here. My gaze flickered to the notebook in my lap. The pen poised to continue planning my presentation. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself replaying the confrontation in first class, dissecting each word, each dismissive glance. This wasn't just about me. It never was. Every microaggression, every assumption about my worth or belonging, it was all part of a larger story. One I'd been fighting to rewrite my entire life. I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, steady and sure, "When they don't see your worth, remind them." With renewed focus, I opened my phone. The message I'd sent to David earlier had already been delivered, but I wasn't done. I composed a follow-up, detailing the humiliating spectacle Rachel had created. My fingers moved with precision. My words sharp but professional. I asked for immediate action and made it clear this wasn't about seeking revenge, it was about accountability. As I hit send, I felt a small but significant shift in my mood. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could ensure that it wouldn't be ignored. I straightened in my seat, reclaiming the dignity Rachel had tried to strip away. A movement in the aisle caught my attention. Jessica, one of the junior flight attendants, was approaching with a tray of drinks. She stopped at my row and leaned in, her expression kind but tinged with unease. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what happened earlier," she said softly, her voice low enough that only I could hear. I looked up at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "Thank you, Jessica," I replied, offering a small smile. "That means a lot." Jessica hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "If there's anything you need, please let me know." I just wanted to say that not everyone agrees with how it was handled." Her words hung in the air. A quiet admission that Rachel's actions hadn't gone unnoticed. I nodded, appreciating her courage. "I'll be fine, but but thank you for saying that, I said, my voice firm but warm. Jessica placed a bottle of water on my tray table and gave me a small, apologetic smile before moving on. Her gesture, though small, felt significant. It was a reminder that even in moments of injustice, there were always allies, people willing to stand against the tide, however quietly. I took a sip of the water, letting the cool liquid steady my thoughts. Across the aisle, a man in a rumpled suit glanced at me, his brow furrowed as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. I met his gaze briefly, then turned back to my notebook. Whatever he thought, whatever the other passengers thought, was irrelevant now. I had a plan, and I was going to see it through. The minutes ticked by, each one bringing a mix of anger and resolve. I could feel the weight of Rachel's actions pressing on me, but I refused to let it crush me. This wasn't just about standing up for myself, it was about setting a precedent. If I let this slide, if I stayed silent, what would that say to the next person in my position? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our cruising altitude. The cabin settled into a rhythm, passengers flipping through magazines or scrolling on their phones. I stared out the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds. They reminded me of my father's words, "You can't control the storm, but you can steer your ship." I tightened my grip on the pen in my hand. Rachel might have thought she'd won, but she didn't realize the storm she'd set in motion. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The minutes dragged as I sat in economy, flipping through my notebook without really seeing the words. My mind was sharp and focused, replaying the confrontation with Rachel in first class. The humiliation still sat heavy in my chest, but something else had taken root, determination. I wasn't about to let her actions define this flight or me. My phone vibrated on the tray table, the screen lighting up with a message from David. "Naomi, I've escalated this. Sit tight. You'll see movement soon." Movement. The word lingered in my mind as I tucked the phone into my bag. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Rachel walking briskly down the aisle toward the galley. Her usual confident stride seemed stiffer, her expression tight. It was subtle, but it was there. Something had shifted. She disappeared behind the curtain at the front of the cabin, and I allowed myself a small, knowing smile. The wheels were turning. Moments later, Jessica reappeared with a tray of drinks. She stopped at my row again, this time leaning in with a whisper. "Ms. Carter, are you sure you're okay?" Her tone was soft but carried genuine concern. "I'm fine, Jessica," I replied, offering her a reassuring smile. "But thank you for asking." She nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "I just wanted to say," she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before continuing. "Not everyone agrees with what happened. It didn't feel right." I studied her face, noting the nervous tension in her voice. Jessica was younger than Rachel, maybe early 20s, and there was an earnestness in her expression that touched me. She was trying to do the right thing, even if it meant risking the disapproval of her colleague. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "That means a lot." Jessica offered a quick smile and moved on, but her words stayed with me. I wasn't alone in this, not entirely. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as I returned to my notebook, jotting down observations. Across the aisle, a man in his 50s leaned slightly toward me. His graying hair was tousled, and his tie was askew, but his eyes were sharp and thoughtful. "That flight attendant," he began in a low voice, nodding toward the curtain, "she gave you a hard time. Didn't she?" I looked at him, weighing my response. "It's been handled," I said simply, not wanting to divulge too much. He nodded, his expression skeptical but not unkind. "Well, if you need a witness, I saw what happened." He straightened in his seat, adjusting his tie as if solidifying his offer of support. "Thank you," I said sincerely. I appreciate that. As the minutes passed, the cabin's atmosphere grew more charged. People were watching, whispering, sensing that something was amiss. When Rachel emerged from the galley again, her shoulders were noticeably tense. She moved down the aisle, checking on passengers with a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite land. Her gaze darted to me once, briefly, before quickly looking away. I couldn't see what had happened in the galley, but I could guess. David didn't waste time, and I knew his escalation had reached the right ears. Perhaps Rachel was beginning to realize that her actions had consequences. I leaned back in my seat, letting the faint vibrations of the plane soothe my nerves. Outside the window, the sky stretched wide and blue, a reminder of the freedom I was fighting for, not just for me but for anyone who might face a similar injustice. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 35,000 feet. We want to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask our crew." I couldn't help but smile at the irony. I'd already asked for dignity and fairness, and it had been denied. But now, the very people who tried to strip it away were starting to feel the weight of their decisions. As Rachel passed by my row again, her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. It was fleeting. But in that moment, I saw something new: unease. Gone was the confident flight attendant who had demanded I move without justification. In her place was someone who, for the first time, looked unsure. The shift was small but significant, and I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Rachel didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The tables had started to turn. And I was just getting started. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the flight settled into its cruising altitude. My pen hovered over my notebook, but my focus wasn't on my notes anymore. I could feel the tension around me. An almost palpable shift in the air. Passengers were whispering, their glances darting between Rachel and me. I kept my composure. Knowing I didn't need to do anything more, things were already moving in my favor. Rachel appeared in the aisle again, her movements more rigid than before. She carried a glass of sparkling water. Her usual confidence now a thin veneer stretched too tightly. She stopped at my row, her eyes briefly meeting mine. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice quieter than I'd heard it before. "I wanted to personally apologize for earlier. There was a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and thick. She placed the glass of water on my tray table with a slight tremor in her hand. The Rachel from earlier, the one who had forced me to move to economy with cold authority, was gone. What stood before me now was a woman trying desperately to regain control. I nodded slowly, taking the glass but setting it aside without drinking. "Thank you," I said, my tone calm but firm. "I appreciate the gesture." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she thought the matter was resolved. But I wasn't finished. However, I continued, meeting her gaze steadily. "This isn't just about a misunderstanding. It's about how I was treated. The way this was handled wasn't acceptable." Rachel's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. I didn't mean to." "Intent doesn't erase impact," I interrupted, my voice steady but unyielding. "What happened today wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an example of a larger problem." She stood frozen for a moment, her polished facade cracking further with every word I spoke. I could see the weight of realization starting to settle on her. "You have a duty to treat every passenger with respect," I said, lowering my voice but keeping it sharp. "Not just the ones you assume belong." Around us, the cabin had gone quiet. Passengers were listening now, their eyes darting between me and Rachel. I wasn't trying to create a scene, but the truth was undeniable. this was already a scene. And if the moment was here, I wasn't going to let it pass without making my point. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She gave a stiff nod and turned away, retreating down the aisle with quick, clipped steps. The tension in her body was visible, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something close to pity. She had made a mistake, a significant one, and now she was feeling its weight. I glanced around the cabin, catching the eyes of a few passengers. Some offered me subtle nods of support, while others quickly looked away. Across the aisle, the man who had offered to be a witness earlier gave me a small, encouraging smile. Jessica, the junior flight attendant, approached me not long after Rachel's departure. Her expression was apologetic but tinged with something else, admiration, perhaps? "Miss Carter," she began, her voice low, "I'm so sorry about everything. If there's anything else I can do for you, please let me know." "You've done enough already," I said, offering her a genuine smile. "Thank you for your kindness, Jessica. It hasn't gone unnoticed." She nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly before she retreated to continue her duties. I watched her go, thinking about how different she was from Rachel. It wasn't just about age or experience, it was about empathy. Time passed slowly after that, the hum of the engines filling the silence left in Rachel's wake. I sipped the sparkling water she had brought, its coolness soothing the lingering heat of frustration in my chest. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly. A canvas of blue and white that reminded me of my purpose. This wasn't just about today. It was about tomorrow and every day after. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice broke through the quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. If there's anything you need, please let our crew know. We hope you enjoy the remainder of your flight." The irony wasn't lost on me. Rachel made one final appearance, checking on passengers in first class. Her steps were slower, her movements more deliberate. I caught her glancing my way once, and in that moment, her expression was unreadable, somewhere between regret and fear. I wondered if she understood the full extent of what had happened, or if she was simply trying to salvage her pride. As the flight continued, I allowed myself to relax slightly. My notebook lay closed on the tray table, the pen resting atop it. The presentation waiting for me at the end of this journey felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to what had unfolded here. But I knew better. This wasn't just a detour, it was part of the same path. Every moment, every challenge, every victory, it was all connected. The engines hummed on, the plane moving steadily through the sky. Somewhere in the front of the plane, Rachel was probably grappling with the fallout of her actions, while Jessica continued to move through the cabin with quiet efficiency. And me? I was still here, still standing tall, even while sitting in a seat I shouldn't have been forced into. This wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of calm. The storm Rachel had tried to create wasn't mine to carry. It was hers, and she would have to weather it. The announcement for the plane's descent came over the intercom, but my mind was elsewhere. I had spent the past hour thinking about my next steps, how I would follow up with David. How this incident could be turned into a catalyst for change. The humiliation I'd felt earlier had morphed into a quiet resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the system that had allowed something like this to happen. Passengers began securing their items, adjusting their seats, and preparing for landing. I stayed still, staring out the window as the city below came into view. The sprawling streets and glittering lights reminded me of where I was headed, a boardroom, a presentation. And a room full of people who would judge my worth not by my ticket but by my ideas. When the plane touched down, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The usual flurry of activity followed, seat belts unclicked, phones powered on, bags pulled from overhead compartments. But I didn't rush. I remained in my seat, watching as the other passengers filed out. The man across the aisle offered me a parting nod, his small gesture of solidarity carrying more weight than he probably realized. Rachel was standing near the exit, her usual poised demeanor replaced with something more brittle. Her smile was still there, but it wavered under the scrutiny of each passing passenger. When our eyes met, she straightened her posture, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice tight. I paused for a moment, considering my response. Finally, I said, "I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon." My tone was neutral, but the weight of my words was not lost on her. Her smile faltered as I walked past. Outside the terminal, the cool evening air was a welcome relief. I pulled out my phone to find a message from David waiting for me. "Naomi, the situation has been escalated. Expect a follow-up call from the board soon. We've got your back." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Change wouldn't come easily, it never did. But knowing I had support made all the difference. Later that evening, as I sat in my hotel room, another message came through. This one was from the airline's executive team, apologizing for the incident and promising a full review of their policies. They assured me that Rachel would be held accountable and that changes were already underway to prevent future occurrences. I read the email twice, letting the words sink in. It was a step in the right direction, but I knew it wasn't enough. Policies were just words unless they were backed by action. I responded with a request for a detailed timeline of their proposed changes, making it clear that I would be watching closely. The next morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from Rachel. The subject line read, "Apology." For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to read it. But curiosity won out. Her message was short but heartfelt. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology for my actions yesterday. I misjudged you, and there's no excuse for how I handled the situation. This experience has been humbling. And it's made me realize how much I need to reflect on my own biases. I'm deeply sorry for the harm I caused and for failing to treat you with the respect you deserved. I promise to learn from this and do better moving forward. Sincerely, Rachel Sanders." I stared at the screen, emotions swirling. It wasn't vindication I felt, it was something quieter, deeper. Her words didn't erase what had happened, but they hinted at something I hadn't expected: growth. Maybe, just maybe, this experience would be the start of real change, not just for Rachel, but for others like her. In the days that followed, the airline made a public announcement about its new training programs, highlighting their commitment to diversity and inclusion. The news made headlines, and while my name wasn't mentioned, I knew my actions had been the spark. Jessica, the junior flight attendant who had shown me kindness, also reached out. She'd been promoted, she told me, and she credited the incident with giving her the courage to speak up. Her message brought a smile to my face. Change, I realized, wasn't just about policies, it was about people. A week later, I found myself back at the airport, boarding another flight for work. This time, the atmosphere was different. The staff greeted me warmly, their smiles genuine. Jessica was among them, supervising the boarding process with a confidence I hadn't seen before. "Miss Carter," she said when she saw me, her voice tinged with pride. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Jessica," I replied, meeting her smile with one of my own. As I settled into my seat, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead was still long, and the fight for change wasn't over. But in this moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to appreciate the progress that had been made. Outside the window, the plane taxied toward the runway. The sky stretched wide and open, a reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. I thought about my father's words again, "Stand tall, Naomi. No one can take your dignity unless you let them." I smiled softly. He was right. The sunset bathed the tarmac in hues of orange and gold as I gazed out the plane window. The hum of the engines was a familiar comfort, but this flight felt different. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not just on the incident but on everything it had set into motion. Jessica walked by. Her movements fluid and confident as she oversaw the first-class cabin. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, knowing smile. "Everything okay, Miss Carter?" she asked. I nodded. "Perfect, thank you." She had grown since our last encounter, her demeanor more assured. I'd later learn that she'd been promoted to a supervisory role. A decision she credited in part to the courage she had shown during the previous flight. Her success felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that even small acts of kindness could lead to meaningful change. As the plane climbed into the sky, I took out my notebook. It was the same one I'd carried on the flight with Rachel, its pages now filled with new ideas and plans. I flipped to a blank page and began to write. "Dear future me. There will be days when you feel small, when the world seems too heavy, and the fight for justice feels endless. But remember this, every moment matters. Every action, no matter how small, creates ripples that can change the tide. Stand tall, always. Not just for yourself but for those who will come after you. Their fight will be lighter because of what you did today. With love and pride. Naomi." As I finished the letter, a sense of calm settled over me. This wasn't the end of the story, it never would be. The fight for equity and respect was ongoing. But this chapter had taught me something valuable: progress is made in steps, not leaps. It's found in the courage to speak up, the humility to learn, and the determination to keep moving forward. I slipped the notebook back into my bag and leaned back in my seat. Outside, the horizon stretched endlessly, a canvas of potential. I thought about my parents. About the sacrifices they had made to give me this life. Their voices still guided me, their lessons etched into every decision I made. The intercom crackled, announcing our cruising altitude. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The road ahead wasn't easy, but I wasn't walking it alone. People like Jessica, even Rachel, had shown me that change was possible, even if it came one person at a time. As the plane soared higher, I allowed myself to dream, not just for me, but for everyone still waiting to be seen, heard, and valued. The ripples I'd started would reach them, too. Of that, I was certain.